All right, so I'm gonna start out by giving just a general outline of the problem that we are facing. Um, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the hard problem of consciousness. If you've heard about it already, I'll explain it anyway. Um, there is this question of what is consciousness? And uh, there's also this concept of qualia, and maybe you've heard about the Mary in the black and white room thought experiment. Mary lives her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen color in her whole life. However, she has studied color and done a whole PhD dissertation on color and can tell you everything that you need to know about like the color purple. But then one day on her computer screen shows up the actual color purple. So even though she could teach a class, she could teach a course on color theory, has she been imparted with new information upon seeing the color purple? And the argument is yes, because although she knew literally everything like that you could put in a book, she has never felt the sensation of the color purple. So another thought experiment is to try to explain to someone a color that they have never seen. It's hard to explain it in words in a way that makes them feel the sensation. So there's the sensation of the feeling that is hard to like just explain in words. You have to sense it. It's basically like, and you can also think of it like if you have a thought, right? It's also kind of a sensation, and this is what qualia is getting at. And then we have the hard problem of consciousness. So first, let me try to define consciousness, right? Um, Consciousness is something very difficult to define because any other word doesn't mean quite the same thing or is so basic that it doesn't contain any meaning. So basically, consciousness is sensation, or the feeling that it's like something to be something. But that feels like it almost doesn't mean anything. What does it mean? It's like something to be something. But I'll give a Theseus thought experiment. Let's say one atom by atom, you replaced my brain with the brain of a bat, and you replaced every cell in my body with the cell of a bat perfectly, but slowly over time. At some point, I know what it's. I'm feeling what it's like to feel like to be a person, but at some point in the future, I'm feeling what it's like to be a bat. And so, what my premise is that when I become a bat, it's not like the lights go off. It's not like I feel nothing. Instead, I feel like what it's like to be a bat. On the contrary, if you were to replace me with a rock, at some point I would feel like what it's like to be a person, and now I feel nothing. It's like the lights go off. It's like I go to sleep, right? And so then the problem with the hard problem of consciousness is essentially like, why does consciousness exist? Why is there like anyone who feels what it's like to be something? Why can't we all be zombies? Which means we go about our motions, our brains do our thing, but there's no like sensation behind it really. And the reason I think the thing is, the hard problem of consciousness is not something you're really going to solve. It's like inventing a perpetual motion machine to solve it, or like getting over the is-ought dichotomy. And the people who claim to solve these kinds of things have really solved a peripheral problem that's like kind of adjacent to the main problem, but not exactly the same thing. So I would actually like to delineate a peripheral problem. For simplicity, I'll call it words I just made up: the easy hard problem and the hard problem. So the hard problem is explaining why does consciousness exist? It's the question of why. But the easy hard problem is the question of what, as in, under what set of circumstances could we like say this thing has consciousness and this thing doesn't have consciousness? You can never really know because that gets to the hard problem, but like if it makes sense, the hard problem will allow you to answer the easy hard problem. It's a set of criteria by which you could say, okay, this ant is not conscious, but this other ant is conscious, like a set of criteria. So how do we really know that other entities are conscious? And this is a section I'll call escaping solipsism. And solipsism is like, how do I know I'm not the only being in the entire universe that's conscious? And many theories hold that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon, is an emergent property of physical processes. So I know that I'm conscious. This is Descartes. I think, therefore I am. I can analogize other people to myself. They are not that dissimilar to me. I go to sleep and wake up. When I'm asleep, for most of it, I'm not conscious. When I wake up, I'm conscious. Other people go to sleep and wake up. I can imagine probably when they go to sleep, they're not conscious. When they wake up, they are, because they're not that dissimilar to me. What about dogs? Are they conscious? Well, they have sort of similar to human brains. Really, the only separation is genetic. If you go back far enough, we're cousins with dogs, but we're not that similar to dogs. So maybe they're conscious, but it's different. So how do you know that anyone else is conscious, right? We can use these kinds of thought experiments, but you never really know because it's the hard problem. Now, I'm going to go over many theories to these problems. And the first caveat is that these thoughts are my own. I will be basing these theories on existing theories. However, I don't claim to represent existing theories. These are my Steelman's or representations of the theories. They're not actually the theories as every one of their proponents would express them. They're just my own interpretations. The second caveat is that this is just an overview, and if you'll obviously have to sketch out more information because I'm going to go over a lot of theories, so some of it is going to have to be brief. Okay, the first theory is bicameralism. And let's go over some quotes of people who have said about bicameralism. Daniel Dennett said, "On the face of it, this theory is preposterous, but also I take it very seriously." Richard Dawkins said, "Either a complete rubbish or a work of consummate genius, nothing in between." So you know that the new atheist types think, oh, it's preposterous but worth taking very seriously. And I don't know about you, but when I hear a theory described like that, I get very excited. But this theory almost has the feel of ancient aliens. It was developed by Julian Jaynes, and it's from a book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And it claims that consciousness is not inherent to our brains, but something that we deliberately create as a product of being in modern society. And he dates the point at which we became conscious at around 1200 BC, or the Bronze Age collapse. He said before that, we didn't really have consciousness. After that, we do. So bicameral, that word comes from split brain patients, where many of you may have heard of split brain patients, where the left brain and the right brain are different. The left brain is language, the right brain is drawing, and it's more impressionistic. Is more impressionistic and responsible for higher level decision making. Communicate by a bundle of fibers in the middle of the brain. But there are people who, if you sever that bundle of fibers, then you essentially have two different minds independent of one another in the same body. And there are experiments that you can do where you take someone and you set it up so that only one of their eyes sees an image, and you show if you show the word boat to one eye, then because one half of the brain controls one eye and one hand, then they will be able to say it but not draw it. But then if you show it to the other eye, they won't be able to say it. And you ask, what did you see? And they say, I don't know. But then if you put the pencil in their other hand and ask them to draw it, they will be able to draw it. And you ask them, why did you draw that? They'll say, oh, I have no idea. And they'll just make up a fake explanation, oh, I've always thought about owning a boat or something like that. And this is kind of interesting. And the theory of bicameralism is essentially that before 1200 BC, these two halves of the brain were more separated, and the right side of the brain communicated and sent messages to the left side of the brain, but the left side interpreted that as communication from the gods. It would hear voices from the right side of the brain and interpret it as the voice of the gods. And the right side would also send hallucinations to the left side, in the Iliad, the goddess came down and gave you the sword. But what really happened is you picked up the sword or something, but you interpreted it as the goddess gave you the sword because it was a hallucination invoked by the right side of the brain. So it's kind of sounds batshit, but, and you ask, how does he place it at 1200 BC? And the answer is the study of language. You have words like psyche and thumos. Psyche, and in the past meant like you bleed out your psyche. After the Bronze Age collapse, it meant something more like impressionistic. But however, you could say before the Bronze Age collapse, it meant like the goddess could give you your psyche. Or this is an example where like words before then meant something very literal, and afterwards they meant something very impressionistic. And so there's a difference between like the external world. Now we are very internal creatures. We imagine abstract concepts, but internally. And in the past, they were more external creatures. Also, one interesting thing when you study literature, going back really, really into ancient times, is that they had no internal states. And so I'm going to send you guys an article in the chat. And this article is titled, Why Ancient Fiction Doesn't Talk About Feelings. When King Harold was doing battle in one of the sagas of the Icelanders written in 1230, the first sentence bristles with purposeful action. King Harold proclaimed a general levy, then gathered a fleet, then summoned his forces far and wide throughout the land, etc., 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 fought numerous battles. What the saga doesn't tell us is how Harold felt about any of this, whether his drive to conquer was fueled by tyrannical father's barely concealed contempt, or whether his legacy ultimately surpassed or fell short of his deepest hopes. So essentially, the characters in the Iliad, it just said the character did X. It didn't say how the character felt about doing X. And modern writers, as we know, there's a mindset difference. They're, if anything, obsessed about talking about internal states, how characters are feeling. But in ancient text, they didn't talk about that. But you know what they were obsessed with? They were obsessed with like the desires and the requests of gods and goddesses, and the god wants you to do X, and the god made X happen, and the god is, commanding you for such and such. So you can imagine that like the gods are taking the place of internal states, and this is very interesting. And hallucinations are something you can bring about in the context of a laboratory. Like when you stimulate certain parts of the brain, you can invoke hallucinations. And sometimes you'll hear your dad or you'll hear your mom, but you can kind of in your head model the mind of your mom. Like think of what your mom would say in this situation. So you have a kind of mental model of your mom. That's how you know what she would think or what she would say. But in the past, people were obsessed with gods and their desires and their affairs and all these stories. So everyone you could think had a very good like mental model of what the gods want and what the gods would think. So you can imagine if you're hearing the voices of anyone, you might hear the voice of Zeus or Thor or something like that. Society was almost organized around these lines, like all the way from gods who commanded entire empires to personal idols that was like an ancestral idol that you kept around in your household when the figurine had big eyes so that when you stood near it, it invoked like this higher level abstraction reasoning. Like the right side of your brain would do some work in terms of abstract reasoning and then send the message to the left side of your brain, and it would think of, so you would know what to do. But society was kind of organized in a like semi-theocracy in this way, like in these city-states. And you kind of need large-scale, complex, integrated societies to bring about this, the need for this, because when you have complicated societies, you have ideas of the nation or pride or like the kin group or the law, things that require like abstract reasonings, which the right side of the brain is responsible for. But then when you have the Bronze Age collapse, people lose this and they become an internal. And stories of Adam and Eve, arguably, like harken back to, like in the Garden of Eden, that was when people were organized. It was like idyllic, and people saw it as like a fall from grace. And they talked about it at the time, like, why can I no longer hear the gods in my head? Why can I no longer hear the voices? And a lot of religious traditions try to recreate the bicameral minds through the use of oracles, like oracles being people who still have the bicamerality. One interesting fact is that the ancient Greeks had no word for body. So because body was redundant, instead of saying like Homer's body, you would just say Homer. Or like instead of saying Agamemnon's body, you just say Agamemnon, because like body is kind of an abstraction. There's for it. You can just refer to the person themselves because there's no difference between them and their body. So I'm going to link an interesting article that talks about hallucinated gods, so you can read it later, from a blog I like called Melting Asphalt. That's kind of the crux of bicameral minds. Like consciousness requires like a higher level reasoning. Like when I just ride my bike or like walk someplace or you drive your car or even like play the piano, you're not necessarily conscious of like the notes that you're playing when you play the piano. It's like an automatic process, and like thinking about that can actually interfere with like playing the piano, right? So the guy's premise is that when you had the era of the bicameral mind, like people weren't actually conscious, and it's like it was brought about very recently in like 1200 BC. Like people became conscious because they needed to understand these abstract concepts in order to live in a complex civilization. But they learned how to internalize those feelings by like integrating their mind more complexly. Okay, the next theory is what I'm going to call the soul theory of consciousness, or the religious theory. And this is like, I'm not claiming actual religious people prescribe to all the arguments I'm giving. This is just a steel man. So I'm sure many people have heard of the Aquinas, like cosmological arguments, right? And so I'm going to generalize the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument goes like that everything must have a cause, and then that causes an infinite regression to the first cause, and the first cause is God, basically. But I'm going to generalize that every phenomenon in the universe must have an explanation, and every explanation needs an explanation, and you can drive it down. So if we have something like the hard problem of consciousness, the problem is essentially, why does consciousness exist, right? And this is a difficult problem to answer, because you can answer it in terms of consciousness exists because of X, but then you're just offloading the problem onto X, because X probably is not like a satisfying answer. Then okay, let's say you want to answer what causes X. Well, X is caused because of Y. Okay, well, what causes Y? Y is caused because of Z. So there's an infinite regress of like explanations where you can never fully explain it. And then the way that the religious people would say is, oh, the ultimate explanation is God causes everything. But wait a second, doesn't that violate the rules that we set up when we said everything needs a cause, right? But wait, those are rules of logic, and God is a non-logical being. He is not of the logical world, so he does not need to abide by the laws of logic. But wait a second, isn't that also a cop-out? Because you can't just invent a new type of thing, like to get out of the rules of your own premise, of your own like thought experiment. But I think that the strength of this is that it shows that there is a paradox, because the paradox is that you have this question which is not fully answerable. Like it's like a plot hole in the laws of logic, like a plot hole in the laws of the universe. And so if you assume that everything needs to be fully explainable, then the fact that you have something like what is consciousness, it's a well-posed, well-formed question, nothing grammatically incoherent about that question. However, it's impossible to fully answer. So to defend the God hypothesis, you would say, okay, well, God isn't logical, but guess what? The universe will never be logical. The universe is just inherently illogical because you have this paradox. So God is just the expression of that, right? So wait a second, the atheist says again, like, doesn't that only get you as far as deism? You can't say anything about the properties of this God, but not so fast. You can say something about the properties of this God, because the original question was what causes consciousness, and if we assume God provides consciousness, then we know that God has the ability to impart consciousness, and if that is the case, then God must have the ability to possess consciousness, so we can imagine God as a conscious being. So that gets us away from calling God an entity to calling him a being, if we define a being as an entity with consciousness. So, but wait, doesn't God create the entire universe, not just consciousness? Well, this gets into ideas of like, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one around to hear it, does that make a sound? I think that's a dumb thought experiment, but like, ultimately the only thing that you can really be sure of is the consciousness. That's all you can be sure of. So insofar as the universe is just something that you experience through that vector, by creating consciousness, you create the universe, right? Then there's the question, okay, what happens after you die? But I think you know where I'm going with this. So, if we have like the theory of conservation of matter, conservation of energy, well, can't we generalize that to the theory of conservation of consciousness? Or if God puts consciousness into the world, well, it can't just be destroyed unless God destroys it. So what exactly God does with those consciousnesses is going to depend on your religion, but at least we can start to ask the question, what happens after you die? Whereas according to what I believe, which is more like materialistic, that doesn't even make sense. Like, your consciousness is a product of the material world, so when your brain dies, like, it's the same as what it was before you were born. But according to this view, consciousness it just rides around in your head. It's not like of your head, if that makes sense. But as you can tell, like, the first theory was an answer to the easy hard problem. This theory is an answer to like the hard problem, if you remember the beginning. Alright, so I'm gonna go on to the third theory, and this theory is panpsychism. And remember when I said that consciousness is a emergent property of physical phenomenon? Well, hold on, before I get to that, let me cut to the chase. What is panpsychism? Well, it is another one of these theories which sounds kind of batshit. It's a case where the straw man of this theory actually is the actual theory. So I'm going to describe the straw man of the theory. The straw man is, which is also the actual theory, that all objects have consciousness. I may be misrepresenting it, like, I'm not, like, speaking for all panpsychists, like, I know there's probably a disagreement here, but, like, according to some instantiations of the theory, rocks have consciousness, trees have consciousness, like, single cells have consciousness, and, like, clumps of atoms have consciousness, right? So, like, everything has consciousness to some degree, but this can make sense if you think about consciousness in terms of a property that, like, has more or less intensity. So, I have consciousness. What about a dog? Does a dog have consciousness? Or, okay, what about a chimp? Does a chimp? Well, we can imagine a chimp has consciousness, but, like, maybe less? Or what about a squirrel? Does a squirrel have consciousness? Well, you can imagine maybe a squirrel does have consciousness, but less than a human. Or what about an ant? Maybe a tiny bit, but not as much as a squirrel, right? And so, according to panpsychism, like, consciousness is something you can intensify by creating the right configuration of material, but there's, like, a very low-level buzz in, like, that goes throughout the entire universe, right? You can think of it like a field, right? The consciousness field. And I'm borrowing field as a term from, like, physics, where a field is a 3D mapping of a quality you can imagine superimposing over the physical space, like an intensity chart. Okay, I have a little visualization about what happens as you travel along space where the consciousness is concentrated. So it starts out not at zero, but like almost zero, like close to zero, amount of consciousness, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then you get to a brain, and then it shoots up, and then it shoots up because you got to a brain, and then it goes back down, and then it's 0, 0, 0, because the brain is an exact configuration of materials that creates higher level, like, information processing. But then we get to a human. Oh, and it shoots up, because a human, really, really smart. probably should be higher than this, but then it comes back down because you're outside the brain, and then almost zero, not quite zero. And it's not quite zero because maybe there is some like marginal amount of information communication between like the brain and outside layers. Like, in fact, if you imagine communication between like the sheep and the person, then maybe it can be some connection that's hard to express in this visual form. Because by expressing that there's some like marginal consciousness in the grass, essentially maybe there's some sort of information encoded in like the heat or something that you can derive patterns from the heat, and from that you can derive that there's some amount of consciousness there. I disagree with this, and so I'll state that, and I'll explain why. I'm going to give an image in the chat, and so open that link and it'll take you to an image, and these are activation functions that are used in machine learning. And so I think that the panpsychism view kind of implies, see the middle one, tan h, where it's a sigmoid function is what they call it, where it never quite gets to 0 or 100%. So like the x-axis is like the state of matter, like the qualities of the thing, and the y-axis is the amount of consciousness. But what I believe is closer to the ReLU, R-E-L-U, because I think there's like a hard threshold where if you get beneath it, like there's just zero consciousness. Because I think that's actually adjust the tan h to imagine that like instead of -1, it starts at 0, just to clarify. But I think like when I look at a rock, I think, okay, that rock is 0% conscious, right? I think because it doesn't meet the threshold where you get the right configuration where it even like qualifies at all. So that's what I think. But if you take this theory seriously, you can start getting into like Buddhist concepts where like there's one mind, right? So to explain, it's very hard to articulate what exactly this means. But if you think about it, like there's what you're experiencing, and then there's what everyone else is experiencing, and there's really no reason to separate out those two things. The only reason that you can't experience what other people are experiencing is because that there's no like good communication between the two minds, but they're both happening simultaneously. So like, why should you care about you specifically? Really, there is no you. There's just experience, and then there's the experience happening in your brain, and then the slightly disconnected experience happening in, you know, the other person's brain, but they're both experience, right? There's no you, but if there was a you would be experiencing it all simultaneously, but you wouldn't know it because each instantiation of it is not aware of the other's existence. I don't know if that makes sense, but like that's not inherent to panpsychism. That's like a way of looking at it. Like it's kind of weird. Like you can think of one brain, right? I mean, sorry, one experience. I'm gonna move on to the next one. This is not one theory, but a bunch of different theories related to like the concept of impulse control. So we start with this question. The question is, what process or sub-process is responsible for consciousness? And you may have heard about studies related to impulse control, or not impulse control, but like when do you make a decision? So if you make someone press a button and the light flashes when they press the button, and at the beginning you time it so that the moment they press the button the light flashes, but over a while you slowly build in a delay. First it's like a millisecond, then it's 2 milliseconds. They keep pressing the button, and at the end of that they just learn to associate there's like as being simultaneous, the button and the light flashing, but they're not consciously aware of that. And then when you reset it, then the light will flash a very short amount of time before they press the button, and they will swear, oh, I didn't press the button. And if you look at more neuroscience-based work, like what I put in the chat, you can actually look at this, if you look at the mind, that the sensations, the parts of the mind that light up when you make a decision, they light up before you're consciously aware of the fact that you made a decision. And so what are the implications of this? Well, this might have implications for free will, but free will is not identical to consciousness, so you might not want to say that the implications are exactly the same. Are you actually conscious of making the decision to press the button? And if you think about, we have the reptilian part of the brain and the logical part of the brain. And the reptilian part of the brain, like part of it is the amygdala, where it's responsible for the flight or flight response. So evaluating a situation for the risk and then to get out of it or fight back or whatever. And also the volume of the amygdala correlates with the size and complexity of one's social network. And so maybe we can imagine consciousness as like an integration of amygdala, like impulse control, like fight or flight kind of thing, with the more higher level parts of the brain that are responsible for a more abstract reasoning. And so you do this abstract reasoning, but you also have an emotional attachment to it where you're always checking, okay, is this going to have problems for me? And there's also this view of the hopeless spectator, where the consciousness process is a byproduct of something else. Consciousness doesn't actually do anything. It's like a waste product. So this is just a hodgepodge of different theories I'm throwing out there just to be inclusive. And you can also think of consciousness as like a brain training mechanism where it doesn't make any decisions, but when you make a decision, it evaluates whether it was good or bad, like to train your brain what to do in the future. What my personal feelings about free will is that I'm a compatibilist, where I think that free will and determinism are compatible, and that's because of things that I'll get into later. Like the computational capacity of the brain. And this is where it gets like most technical and most exciting. Great. Now I'm going to talk about concepts of graph theory. And by graph theory, it's a computer science concept meaning networks. So like we use these in artificial intelligence. So studying artificial intelligence can maybe give us clues as to how consciousness functions. I'm going to send you a picture in the chat. This is a picture of different networks. And if you'll see, the one on the left is centralized, the one on the middle is decentralized, and the one on the right is distributed, right? Sorry about that. I'm dodging calls so I can finish this. So if you think of the brain, is the brain more decentralized or distributed? We know it's probably not centralized, right? So in the brain, there's the exact right combination. There's enough connectedness to properly integrate information, but enough segregation to allow for the delineation of information. And that sentence is a bit complicated. So I'm going to put it in the chat, actually, like what I just read. Enough connectedness to properly integrate information, but enough segregation to allow the delineation of information. And the delineation of information connects to the thousand brains theory of intelligence. I'm going to give you a link to a Lex Friedman podcast where he actually talks about the thousand brain theory of consciousness. But full disclosure, I don't actually know much about this theory, but it's one that's interesting to note, like, because it connects to that there needs to be some sort of decentralization for the consciousness to emerge. So it's just the right combination. And then there's this other paper I'm going to put in the chat. It's a paper about like the mathematics of the brain. And it says brain computation is organized via power of two based permutational logic, which by power of two logic, it means that n equals 2 to the I, right? So however the size of it is, if you have like 10,000 neurons, it's organized based on 2 to the power of 10,000, which in terms of computation is just insane. It's insane degree of computation, right? And this is how brains get so complicated. So if you think about free will, right? If I put a gun to someone's head and tell them, go rob a bank, and they rob the bank, you can't really say they did it of any freedom at all, because there is one clear identifiable cause of the gun, and that was the only reason they did it. And so you can trace everything back to a distinct cause, right? then also if someone did it, let's say they have a brain tumor and the brain tumor made them do something crazy, like shoot up a bunch of people. Did they do it of their free will? Well, also intuitively we say no, because it was a one cause that caused them to do it. It was the brain tumor. And so we can trace it back to that one cause, right? But a brain is so complicated because of power of two based logic. Sometimes we have a difficult decision and it's not clear why we made the decision we did. We just say, oh, I have the intuition that I'm going to do X. And what does intuition mean? Well, it kind of gets at that it's just the product of such complexity that it allowed for that decision. And it's very difficult to model the decision-making of a brain because of its complexity and unpredictability. And so, according to the compatibilist view, we can sort of imagine that free will is getting to a point where the decision-making is so complicated that it's very difficult to model because of how the neural network is organized. And then we can just label consciousness as that thing which enables free will, essentially. Reliance on the complex system, and which we call intuition. So there are different ways. There are different people who think different things about that. So like, I'm just giving. Of course, everything I say here is like my own steel manning, my own interpretation. But yeah, that's the first part of graph theory. Then there's another fact about graph theory that is very important to go over, but it's very hard to explain. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to explain it well. Maybe I'll have to try like 5 times before I get it across. So are you ready? Let's try this. So if you think a neural network, there are different layers to the neural network. There's the hidden layer, the input layer, which takes in the input. Then there's the hidden layers, and there's multiple hidden layers. And then there's the output layer, which generates the output. And let's say there's kind of a direction you want this to go. You want to start with the hidden layer, and then layer 1, then layer 2, then layer 3. And you need that directionality because, like, let's say you have a neural network that wants to process an image that is like a numbers written on a piece of paper and tell you what is or even process, like you write words on a piece of paper and it processes what are those words that you wrote, right? What are the different layers responsible for? The input layer, maybe it would like look at individual pixels of the image, and then the first hidden layer would try to aggregate that information into like blobs of like areas of the image that are dark and areas of the image that are like not written on, because there's some compressibility there. And then the second hidden layer would try to make out distinct like lines of the marks of the letters. And then the third would try to make out particular letters. And then the fourth would make out particular words. And then there's like an upwards stack there. And then the output layer would say, oh, what is the sentence that you wrote, or something. And so we can kind of also imagine that the brain, there's a like higher level and lower level type stuff where like the input is the sense data, like what you see with your eyes, what hits your retina, right? And the output data is the muscle movement, like the muscles, right? And there's a certain layering there. However, here's the key component. In artificial intelligence, there's the concept called recurrence, which is where like layer 2 might talk to layer 3, but layer 3 also talks to layer 2. And that is what generates, in part, the power of 2 based logic that I talked to earlier. So you can imagine an assembly line where station 5 of the assembly line also talks to station 3 of the assembly line. Now, what is the significance of this? Who cares? There's recurrence. Well, I think the most interesting person in this field is Anil Seth, who is a researcher of the brain who has studied a lot the theory of consciousness from a neuroscience perspective. And I actually want to put in the chat a section from a talk that was given by Neil Seth about this topic.
The classical view is that the brain processes sensory information in a bottom-up or feed-forward direction. So this is a picture of the visual system of the monkey, and the idea is that information comes in through the retina, it then goes through the thalamus, it then goes through the back of the brain, and as the sensory signals percolate deeper and deeper and deeper into the brain, they encode or represent progressively more sophisticated features of objects. So you start out at early levels of visual cortex with response to luminance and edges, and then higher up to objects, including other monkeys. What's important here is that the perceptual heavy lifting is done by information flowing in this bottom-up or feed-forward direction. Now, the Bayesian brain idea says something very different. It says that what's really important are the top-down or inside-out connections that flow from the center of the brain back out. And we've known for a long time there's a large number, very large number of these connections, and some descriptions more than flow the other way around. But their function has been rather mysterious. Thinking about the Bayesian brain gives us a nice way to interpret this, which is that it's exactly these top-down or inside-out connections that convey predictions from high levels of the brain to lower levels, back out to the sensory surfaces. So these blue arrows convey the brain's predictions about the causes of sensory signals. And then what flows in the feed-forward or bottom-up direction from the outside in, that's just the prediction error, the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at each level of description. So this is often called predictive coding or predictive processing in some formal frameworks. And the idea is that minimization of prediction error then occurs across all levels of this hierarchy at the same time, and what we then perceive is the consequence of this joint minimization of prediction error. So you can think of perception as a sort of controlled hallucination in which our perceptual predictions are being reined in at all points by sensory information from the world and the body.
Okay, I didn't want to play too much of the video, but I think you get the general idea that there's a connection between the synapses flowing in the quote-unquote wrong direction and prediction, right? So then you can imagine that if you have neurons flowing in, or synapses flowing in only one direction, it keeps things simple, easy to compute. But if you have synapses flowing in every direction, it becomes very complex, like this power of two based logic I talked about. And so if you want my theory about, and here's the climax, here's my theory of what is consciousness. My theory is that consciousness and imagination are very closely linked. So you are conscious, like, sort of insofar as you are imaginative, but the distinction is caused because, like, what we call imagination is not complete. So I think of imagination as a type of prediction, where let's go back to recurrence, right? So if I tell you to imagine or visualize like a purple elephant, right? Think of what's happening in your brain. First, you hear the words, then you hear the sounds rather, then you decode the sounds into distinct words, then you use the words to look up the meaning of those words, and then you look at like the concepts behind the meanings of those words, and then you combine the purple and elephant together, and then at the culmination of that, you can sort of see, like a hallucination, the purple elephant. But if you think about it, isn't that a like lower level part of the brain? Like, as soon as light hits your retinas, you can see something, but you're able to simulate that just by my words telling you to visualize the purple element. So like, there's thoughts flowing in a bottom-up direction, and there's thoughts flowing in a top-down direction. And an interesting part about that is the recombination of concepts. So let's say I tell you to think of a lizard with the wings of a bat, but, you know, the tail of a donkey and the legs of a goose. And I don't want to make it too complicated, because at a certain point you're not going to be able to visualize it, but these are a bunch of different concepts which you can recombine. Like each of these concepts, like a lizard, you probably are able to visualize a lizard because it's like a memory. It's the aggregation of all of the lizards you've ever seen. And so you have somewhere stored in your head the information about what a lizard is. But you can visualize what I'm telling you to visualize if you recombine all of these memories together into one like integrated whole. So that doesn't actually exist, but it's based on existing memories. And so if we think of imagination as a form of planning, why did it evolve? What is the purpose of it? Well, I think it's quite trivial to say why planning evolved. Planning evolved because you want to be able to simulate different futures in order to know what to do. Like if you make a robot that needs to decide between decision A and decision B, it needs to think about what are the 5 most likely outcomes of decision A, what are the 5 most likely outcomes of decision B, and then do a kind of decision theory calculation to determine which decision is best. But in order to do that, you need to model in your brain something that's fake, something that is not actually real. It's just made up like extrapolation of what might happen. So that's what imagination is for. In order to decide what to do, you need to model fake states of things, right? That's imagination. So I think that covers basically the theories that I want to cover. I covered bicameralism, if you can remember all the way to the beginning, you've been with us. Then there's the souls theory, then there's panpsychism, then there's conscious subprocesses like impulse control explanation. This isn't one explanation, it's just like a lot of the stuff I talked about in the middle. Then there's the kind of free will related decentralization explanation. If you don't buy my explanation of free will, just focus on what you do agree with. And then there's a graph theory, recurrence, like imagination, idea of consciousness. So you're free to, I'm just curious, after I went over all of those different theories, like how people would vote on like what's the most popular, in terms of what people support. And also, if your theory of consciousness is different than anything I've explained so far, it would be good to, if you're feeling ambitious enough, then you can go ahead and explain it here, and then we'll think about that.